Okay, so I'm just going to take you through the upcoming English task for Year 11. This task is a common task for all of the advanced and standard students. So it's related to the module that you're studying at the moment, which is reading to write. You'll notice that the task is worth 15% for knowledge and understanding of the course content. So in this instance, because your assessment is based around the film that you're studying, Captain Fantastic, it's 15% of your knowledge and understanding of that particular text, and then 15% in terms of your skills in responding to the text. So your ability to, in this case, write an imaginative piece of writing and also a reflection. And we'll go through those components of the task in more detail shortly. So this task is due on the 28th of March, so that is the Thursday of week 9. You'll notice the outcomes are then listed below, and there are separate outcomes for the English Standard students and also the English Advanced students. So you might like to read those in your own time. So we'll go through the aspects of the task, and you may like to use your highlighting tools on the PDF that you've downloaded from Sector, or you might choose to write some notes elsewhere just to jog your memory when it comes time to complete the task. So the task is split up into two parts. The first part, part A, you are asked to compose a piece of imaginative writing that represents one of the characters from the film Captain Fantastic. The piece of writing that you compose must take place 10 years after the film has finished and reflect back on a lasting experience you have encountered in the film. You should explore how, through the benefit of hindsight, you have developed a broader understanding of how this experience has helped shape who you have become. So thinking about the characters in Captain Fantastic, you might choose, for example, the father. So thinking about some of the experiences within the film that have had a lasting impact. So you'll notice that within the film, many of the characters actually go through a process of change. The characters that they are in the very beginning of the film are very different to the characters at the end of the film. And thinking about that this particular piece of imaginative writing takes place 10 years after that, you'll need to do some planning and some thinking around what impact has happened on that character and that the change process that has occurred within the piece that you wish to present 10 years after the film has finished. Now, thinking about the benefit of hindsight. So the benefit of hindsight is the ability to look back on these lasting experiences that you've encountered. So if you choose one of the really significant moments in the film for the character you've chosen, what about that 10 years later allows you to look back on that experience with hindsight and perhaps see things a little bit differently? Was that experience really beneficial for the person that you've become? Has it helped shape who that character has become? Or perhaps has it hindered their experiences and what opportunities they've had offered to them? So you might do some planning around that and think about how you might put that together in a piece of imaginative writing. Will you have perhaps a flashback to this lasting experience? Or will it be the character reflecting back on aspects of experiences that happened in the film? So how exactly are you going to put that into writing? Within your piece of imaginative writing, you must also explore the notion of voices from the fringe. So you've spent quite a lot of time this term exploring that concept of voices from the fringe. So what in terms of the characters have meant that there's perhaps still being represented or reflected as being on the fringe, or have they had the ability through their hindsight of the experiences that they've encountered Are they less on the fringe, and they're able to look back on their experiences from the fringe with new eyes? Your response for part A should be between 800 and 1,000 words in length. So when you think about the things that you need to incorporate within your imaginative piece, obviously you need to develop a sense of character and a sense of their voice. You need to think about the lasting experience that you've encountered in the film. So you'll need to incorporate aspects or elements of that representation for that character, and think about how 10 years on that has helped shape who they have become today. So your ability to show that change process that's occurred. Because no doubt within 10 years' time that character would have changed due to their experiences. So that's quite a lot that you need to be putting into that 800 to 1,000 word range. So you'll really need to think about what key elements need to be included, and think about how you might approach your piece of imaginative writing to include all of those things in that short time frame in terms of that word length. It is really important to remember that this is a word range, so you aren't able to go over that 1,000 word limit. And the reason for that is to create a sense of equity. If one student really sticks to that word limit and doesn't go over that 1,000 words, and then another student has the opportunity to put more detail and description and then the ability to really vocalize that voice for the character because they've gone over that word range, that creates an equity issue. So it's really important that you stick to that word range there and not go over. When we look over at part B, so part B is a reflection. So you are to critically reflect upon and analyse your own imaginative composition. The following questions should be used as subheadings for your reflection. You should also include quotations or specific references from your own work where appropriate. So part B, you're reflecting on your imaginative task from part A. And these questions here will become subheadings in your reflection. So the first question says, describe the way you have used structural features for your chosen form. Explain any manipulations of structure that you have used and the intended effect of these. So thinking about the structural features of a narrative, if you chose to do a narrative, what features have you employed in terms of structuring your narrative? Have you written your piece within first-person narration? And what effect does that create? Have you used flashbacks or flash forwards? Have you used some diary entries or some letters within your piece of imaginative writing? So thinking about how perhaps you've manipulated that traditional narrative structure. Perhaps you might start at the beginning of, you might start your piece at the end of your story where the character has ended up, and then backtrack and actually explore how they have developed their current sense of self or voice due to those experiences that they've encountered. So thinking about also the effect of these. So those structural manipulations that you may have employed, like flashbacks or flash forwards or whatever it might be, what reason have you chosen to do those things? Question 2, you are to select 2 to 3 examples of effective use of language techniques in your piece. Provide quotes to identify the technique or techniques that you have used and explain your intended effect on the reader. So once you've finished your piece of imaginative writing, I would go back and look at where have you really used some strong language techniques. Is there a really great metaphor that you've incorporated, or have you used some personification? Have you used perhaps some similes in certain places? What language techniques have you used to really develop that sense of character or that sense of voice or the description in terms of the place that you've set your story. So how have you used language techniques? Now, because it says 2 to 3 examples, I would try to use different examples. So for instance, I wouldn't use 2 examples of metaphor. I might talk about how I've used one metaphor, and then a different example I might use how I've incorporated a motif, or I've tried to develop a sense of tone for my piece to give a certain effect for the reader. Now, this is also a really good cue if you've gone back after you've finished your piece of imaginative writing and it's difficult to find some really effective use of language techniques. That might be some insight for you that perhaps you need to go back and edit your work and make sure that you're using some really effective language techniques in your imaginative writing so that you're able to address this section of the question in the reflection. Question 3, what key ideas regarding voices from the fringe were you attempting to communicate to your reader, and how have you communicated them? And you can quote your work to illustrate this. Now, this question is really great because it's kind of your fail-safe. So you'll remember back when we were going through part A that you needed to incorporate the notion of voices from the fringe. So if you feel like perhaps that isn't a really strong element within your story and you're having to really articulate that here, perhaps that's another cue for you to go back to your work and think about how you could really embed that key idea in terms of voices from the fringe, to really articulate that for your marker so that when they're reading your piece, they're able to identify that as well. So you might choose, in terms of quoting your work and illustrating how you've had that effect on your reader, you might structure some of these questions to be peel paragraphs so that you're using your quotes and your evidence in order to articulate your intended effect on the reader. So that might be how you choose to structure these questions. Your response for part B should be between 600 and 800 words. And the questions themselves are not included in the word count. So you can just simply copy and paste these questions from the PDF and put them in your reflection. And these particular questions here aren't included in that 600 to 800 word limit. And again, being mindful to stay within that range. You are to upload your submission through Turnitin by the due date. Submissions for this task will close at midnight on the due date. You are reminded to adhere to the academic honesty policy when completing your task. Okay, I'm going to now go through the 4 things that the markers will be looking for when marking your work. So the first of which, and we'll go through these in more detail when I look at the marking criteria. So I'll just read these through. So compose a piece of imaginative writing which reflects an aspect of the film. Your ability to communicate your understanding of the concept of voices from the fringe, your use of language and structure appropriate to audience, purpose, context, and the selected form, and reflect on your structural and language choices made within your piece of imaginative writing. Okay, so going through the marking criteria, and I'll go through that A range up the top. So the first thing that the markers will be looking for is your ability to compose an engaging piece of imaginative writing that reflects an aspect of the film. Now, in order for that to be a skillful and engaging piece, you'll need to really work on developing that sense of character, that sense of voice, and being able to really identify that reflection of that character and the way in which they've changed throughout the film. So that bullet point there really refers to you being able to take that film as a springboard for your character and thinking about how you can articulate and imaginatively put together a piece of writing that reflects them 10 years on. So what changes may have been developed. The second bullet point there is skillfully explores the notion of voices from the fringe. So you'll notice there that concept of voices from the fringe is really significant. It's one of the 4 key things that we're looking at. So perhaps your character might reflect back on the experiences that they had in the film and think about how they were on the fringe and what impact that had on their life. And perhaps you might also then consider how that, due to hindsight, has impacted them in their current life. So how are they still perhaps voices from the fringe? And how you incorporate that voice within your piece. The third thing that we're going to be looking for is your ability to demonstrate skillful control of language and structure appropriate to audience, purpose, context, and selected form. Now, this is a really interesting one because this is your ability to compose a piece of imaginative writing, and it says your selected form. Now, a lot of people might choose to do a narrative. However, it says it's an imaginative form. So you can choose to do any form in which you wish, provided you're able to skillfully control your use of language and the structure of that choice of form. Okay? Your audience, purpose, and context. Now, if I was thinking about this particular aspect and thinking about audience and purpose, now, if I was writing a narrative and I was thinking about the audience in which my intended audience was, perhaps I would also make mention of that in my reflections. So I might make mention of who my audience and why I've made particular choices in terms of language, or why I've made particular choices in terms of structure to suit that particular audience. So this bullet point here is all about your ability to compose a piece of imaginative writing that communicates these ideas here. And finally, the last bullet point here refers to part B, your reflection. So critically reflects on your own writing, analysing and evaluating the effectiveness of your use of language, forms, features and techniques of the chosen imaginative form. So these are the things here that are referred to in those questions that you're used to ask. Your language forms, your language techniques that you use, or the features of your writing, and also the structure of your writing. Now, in order to be critically reflect, you will need to break down why you've made those particular choices, why you've chosen to use that particular metaphor, what is the effect of that metaphor, how does it show that there's a voice from the fringe, how has it shown that through the benefit of hindsight, the character has developed or changed or grown in some way. So really being able to break down the examples that you've chosen and why you've done those things. Okay, so that pretty much takes us through the marking criteria and the task itself. So if you now take your time to go through that, if you have any further questions, please feel free to send me an email or to ask me, or you can ask your English teacher directly. Now you'll remember that this is our common task for all English Standard and English Advanced students. So this criteria is the same criteria that we use for all Advanced and Standard students. So it will be marked evenly.